Dear students, now we are going to discuss factors affecting rate of photosynthesis. What are the factors influencing photosynthetic rate of the reaction? Depends on a number of factors. Factors affecting So here photosynthesis is anabolic pathway. It depends on majorly we divided factors into two categories: internal and external factors. Internal factors, plant factors. So all these are plant factors. Internal factors depends on genetic predisposition, means decided by genetic material of that organism. Definitely internal factors means plant factors, maybe type of the leaf, number of leaves, size, and so on, chlorophyll content. Depends on the genetic material received from the parent plant. So genetic predisposition means already decided. It depends on genetic material. And plant growth. Plant growth also. Plant growth. Not only this one, plant growth also. During various stages of developmental stages, definitely that is able to bring change in number of leaves and leaves exposed to sunlight also, chlorophyll content also, plant growth. That is also factor. So what are the internal factors? So first one, leaf-based factors. What are the leaf-based factors? So here leaf-based factors means number of leaves, number of leaves, size means surface area, number, size, orientation, arrangement of leaf, orientation of leaf. Next, quantity or amount of mesophyll cells, and in that leaf number of chloroplasts, chloroplast number, and inside the chloroplast quantity of chlorophyll. Okay, more is the number of leaves. Usually more is the rate of photosynthesis. More surface area, more rate of photosynthesis. Orientation, if all the leaves are properly exposed to sunlight, more rate of photosynthesis. Overcrowding, some leaves are in shadow, less rate of photosynthesis. Youngest mesophyll leaves, age also factor. Age of the leaf also. Youngest leaf, more rate of photosynthesis, more chlorophyll, more number of chlorophylls. Plus old leaf, photosynthetic rate is very less. So all these are decided by particularly genetic material and growth also. Next, internal concentration of CO2. So CO2 concentration within the plant must be optimum. So internal concentration of CO2 depends on stomata number, particularly stomata number, and opened, unopened stomata. So all these factors are able to decide a rate of photosynthesis. And second factor, external factors. Abiotic factors, environmental factors, internal biotic factor, external abiotic factor. So what are the external factors? Light, temperature, external CO2 concentration, temperature, and water to some extent. So all these are the factors which are able to decide a rate of photosynthesis. All these factors must be at a optimum concentration, then only maximum yield, photosynthetic yield is possible. So to understand the factors affecting rate of photosynthesis, we should understand or we should study Blackman's law of limiting factors. Blackman's law of limiting factors. So the academic progress of a student depends on a number of factors: student factor, faculty factor, question paper factor, exam pattern factor, and climatic conditions in the college. All these are able to decide the academic rate, productivity of that student. So the academics of a student, if you take that one as a biochemical reaction, for example, it is regulated by a number of factors. If any one of the factors, several factors are there: student factor, faculty factor, material factor, and so many factors. If any factor is less than required, definitely the rate of or yield of the student will be very less. So like that, according to Blackman's law of limiting factors, biochemical process or like a photosynthesis is regulated by a number of separate factors. So this law of limiting factors, Blackman's law of limiting factors, was based on Liebig's law of minima, a physicist, Liebig's law of minima. But that is in the case of physics. So here, biologically, we have to focus on Blackman's law of limiting factors. Limiting factor. So according to Blackman's law of limiting factors, when a process, a biochemical reaction, for example, photosynthesis, is controlled by, regulated by a number of separate factors. All these are separate individual factors, number separate, size, orientation, mesophyll, and light, CO2, temperature, different physical factors, and plant factors. So here photosynthesis is regulated by a number of factors. Blackman's law of limiting factor is not only applicable to photosynthesis, applicable to any biochemical reaction, any physiological event. Here we are using that one under the heading photosynthesis. It is applicable to respiration also, or some other event which is regulated by more than one factor, different factors. So according to limiting factor, the law, the word itself indicating limiting. What is that limiting factor? When a process is regulated by a number of separate factors, the rate of That reaction, say photosynthesis, depends on a factor which is at a suboptimum level or less than required or below the minimum requirement. What about the critical concentration? We can say if it is below the optimum level, means suboptimum level, less available, limiting factor, not up to the required quantity. So if it is less than optimum, definitely less than minimum value, less than critical concentration, that is called as a suboptimum level. Definitely the rate of the reaction will be very less. So that factor, a factor which is less available or below the required concentration, depth of requirement at a suboptimum level, less than required, definitely that is a limiting factor that is able to limit a rate of photosynthesis. For example, in this case, here I'm taking all these factors, light, CO2, temperature, for example. Light, optimum level, temperature, optimum, water, optimum, CO2 is not optimum, less than required. Definitely, the rate of photosynthetic yield declines. If it is restored, if a proper concentration of CO2 is maintained, definitely rate of photosynthesis increases. So to understand law of limiting factors, in our textbook, one graph was given. What is that? Blackman's law of limiting factors. So according to Blackman's law of limiting factors, so generally fluctuation in factors common. In the case of student career also, fluctuations are possible. Try to restore it. Here also, light, temperature, water availability, always fluctuating. They are not always at optimum concentration. Okay, so decrease and increase is possible. These two are able to influence the yield of photosynthesis. Okay, so in our textbook, the given graph that shows, this is very, very important. Okay, so this graph is going to explain limiting factor. So what are the limiting factors? Okay, so first factor, not before this one, we should take one by one factors. Wait, please. So first one, first factor, external factor, light. Light as a limiting factor. Okay, so the influence of light on photosynthetic yield is in three ways, threefold, three ways. Three ways or threefold. What is that, a threefold? So light is able to affect photosynthesis in three ways. What are those three ways? Okay, so first one is a quality of light. Light quality. Quality of light. So in the case of red and blue, highest rate of photosynthesis, maximum photosynthetic yield. In green, in the case of green, no photosynthesis. Green, no photosynthesis. And other colors out of FGR, violet, indigo, like that, negligible photosynthesis. But definitely according to quality, color of the light, highest rate of photosynthesis in the case of blue and red. Negligible in rest except green, where or at which green light, zero photosynthetic yield, no photosynthesis. That is a quality, intensity of light. Intensity means wavelength of light, wavelength. Around 340 to 700, or better, according to our textbook, 400 to 700 nanometers. This wavelength of light is called as PAR, photosynthetically active radiation. Photosynthetically active radiation means more rate of photosynthesis, or photosynthetically active radiation. It is around 340 to 730 or 760. But according to our textbook, you can take 400 to 700. Blue and red, photosynthetically active radiation. Intensity of light refers to wavelength of light. Next, duration of light. Duration, continuous or discontinuous. If the light is continuous light, and light in flashes, discontinuous. So rate of photosynthesis yield, for example, continuous light, for example, 10 glucose molecules, for example. Discontinuous, intermittent light, in a given period of time, for example, 20 glucose molecules. So in the discontinuous light, photosynthetic yield is more. Continuous light, less rate of photosynthetic yield. So generally, light is not a limiting factor. In nature, light is not a limiting factor. Out of a total incident light, light saturation means optimum light, optimum concentration percentage of light is 10% out of a total availability of light, total amount of light reaching the leaf. Just 10% is enough for optimum photosynthetic yield. 10% enough. So definitely, according to the 10% light in nature, it is not a limiting factor. Generally, it is not a limiting factor, except so light is not a limiting factor in nature, except conditions, except certain number of conditions. What are they? Cloudy clouds. Definitely, the light is limiting factor. Clouds are present. Rainy season. Okay, rainy season, full of thick clouds, a less rate of photosynthesis. And plants, for example, plants living in shady localities. Shady localities. Ceophytes and heliophytes. Here it is a ceophyte. Plants living in shady localities. Okay, so definitely light is a limiting factor. So if the plant is growing in shady localities where the intensity of light is very less, so generally plants in shady localities, generally they exhibit a character that is etiolation. Etiolation. What is etiolation? Generally, plants those which are growing in shady localities, they exhibit such number of characteristics. What are they? 1, elongated stem. Weak stem, feeble stem, not the strong one, over elongation. And second one, less number of leaves. Less number of leaves. Third one, less chlorophyll. Okay, so particularly less number of leaves, but more particularly less chlorophyll. Less chlorophyll leaves is nothing but etiolation. So etiolated plants. Etiolated plants. Rate of photosynthetic yield is very less. Reason, in that area, the limiting factor is light. Light is the limiting factor. Okay, so that is about light. Next, now we should take the graph of Blackman's law of limiting factors. Okay. Etiolation, decreased synthesis of chlorophyll, less chlorophyll content. Etiolation. So now what about the graph? So light intensity, and the rate of the reaction or progression of the reaction, rate of the photosynthesis. Okay, so zero light, no light, definitely there will be no photosynthesis. Gradually, light intensity increased from here to some extent. Now, what about the rate of photosynthetic yield? If light is increased, so gradually increase the light, definitely rate of photosynthesis begins increasing. Okay. Right. So in the textbook given points A. So here photosynthetic yield declines if light intensity declines. Photosynthetic yield from there onwards increases. Those arrows indicate a decline and increase. So for example, in A region, this is A region. For example, X I'm taking, it was not given. X light intensity, for example, only. Whatever the quantity of light, X concentration of light. So at X concentration of light, in A region, for example, only total number of glucose molecules, 10 glucose molecules, G, glucose molecules. So at X light intensity, number of glucose molecules, only 10 glucose molecules, 10 only. Next, D light intensity, according to textbook D. Now take a B region. B region, for example, at a B region, number of glucose molecules. Here, the number of glucose molecules in B region here, 100 glucose molecules. For example, only 100 glucose molecules at a B region. This is a B region. Next, light intensity from D to D onwards increased. Increased from D to some X level, whatever the level, D1, D2, and so on. Just I'm adding here D1, D2, D3, D4 levels, for example, only. What about a rate of photosynthesis? For example, this one is C region. At a C region also, number of glucose molecules, G, 100 glucose molecules. So from B to C, there is no enhancement in number of glucose molecules. Even if light is increased from D to D1, D2, 3, D4 like that. Reason here, what it D indicates, this part D indicates light saturation. Light saturation. Light saturation means light is optimum. Light is not a factor. Light is not a factor means not a limiting factor. See, from D to D1, D2, D4 like that. There is no increase in photosynthetic yield. So according to this, D is not a limiting factor from D onwards. Even if it is increased from D to onwards, there is no enhancement. Okay, reason here, some other factor. What are some other factors? Maybe CO2 or temperature or H2O or leaf. They are the limiting factors. If you observe the graph from D to C, what about the line? Straight line. There is no enhancement in photosynthetic yield. Reason, other than light, are the limiting factors. If you observe from D onwards, there was an enhancement in light. Even though light intensity is increased or duration is increased, there is no increase in photosynthetic yield. Reason, at a C region, other factors are limiting. Light is not limiting. According to 100 glucose molecules at B region, 100 glucose molecules at C region, we can take a D is a saturation point of light, means optimum concentration of light. So E represents rate of photosynthetic yield. Okay, at a B and a C regions. This one also E region that represents photosynthetic yield at A. Okay, so E is a rate of photosynthesis. Next, at A region, here I'm taking A region, light is definitely limiting factor. Light is limiting factor. Okay, at a B and a C regions, other than light, are limiting factors. Light is not a limiting factor according to 100 glucose molecules, 100 glucose molecules. And D represents, in textbook D only given, just D1, D2 I created. And D, light saturation. Light saturation means optimum concentration of optimum light. That is enough. D is enough. D1, D2, D3, D4 not required, more than required. Okay, right? So that's about Blackman's law of limiting factor. So according to this graph, even though light is at optimum, rate of photosynthetic yield from B to C or some other level is same. 100 glucose molecules in a given period of time. Definitely some other factor, that may be CO2 or temperature or H2O or leaf, chlorophyll, some other factor is limiting. If we are able to trace out that factor, for example, if CO2 is the limiting factor, increase the CO2 concentration in that area. For example, in student, for example, botany, zoology, physics, chemistry, any one of them is a limiting factor. Trace out and increase that level, definitely he will get a medical seat. Is or not, right? So that's about Blackman's law of limiting factors. Out of all factors, light completed. Next one. And what about CO2 concentration? First factor, light completed. Second, external factor, CO2 concentration, both externally and internally. Okay, so internal concentration of CO2, external concentration of CO2. So CO2 is a prime raw material, most important prime raw material, most important one. And this is a major limiting factor, prime limiting factor. Major limiting factor. According to our textbook, CO2 is a limiting factor. So in atmosphere, the percentage availability of volume of or percentage of CO2 in atmosphere is 0.03 to 0.04 percentage was given. So this concentration of CO2 is a limiting factor. Limiting factor. But according to global warming, CO2 concentration is too much. It leads to warming. Contrasting or not? But according to our textbook, we should follow this one. 0.03 to 0.04 is limiting factor. Less than required. Suboptimum level. Optimum concentration. According to textbook, optimum concentration is 0.05. That is optimum. If it is more than 0.05, greater than 0.05% is definitely higher concentration, a limiting factor, more concentration of CO2. It's a toxic to chlorophyll and plant. Rate of photosynthetic yield declines. Closing down of stomata simply. Over concentration of CO2, higher concentration of CO2, more CO2. Definitely closing down. Closing down of stomata. Yeah, they can close down. So here optimum concentration is 0.05% only, not more than that. Okay, right? So for example, C3 and C4 plants. That statement is very, very important. C3 and C4 plants behave differently at a different concentration of CO2 and light. For example, low light intensity, high concentration of CO2, both are not able to respond. Low light intensity, high CO2 concentration, no response. Means rate of photosynthesis is very less or negligible. High light intensity, high CO2 concentration. Definitely both are able to perform effective photosynthesis. So here I'm taking C3 plants. In C3 plants, what about the optimum concentration of a CO2? In C3 plants, optimum concentration. Optimum CO2 concentration, according to given textbook statement. In C3 plants, 460 microliter universe. So that much concentration, more concentration of CO2 is required. In C4 plants, the given one is 350 microliters universe. So in the case of C4 plants, less concentration of CO2, enough. But what about a C3 plants? Externally, more concentration of CO2 is required. Reason, in the case of C3 plants, the problem is photorespiration. Photorespiration. So to prevent photorespiration, more concentration of CO2 is required. Externally, more concentration of CO2 is required for optimum photosynthetic yield in C3 plants. Reason, photorespiration, C2 cycle, glycolate metabolism. So that's why compulsory we have to cultivate C3 plants. So cultivation of we have to cultivate C3 plants. in the area where CO2 is more. Means we have to cultivate them in the area which is that area is enriched with more CO2 content, more amount of CO2 is available to prevent photorespiration. Okay, so two examples given in our textbook. Greenhouse crops. Greenhouse gas is well known to you. That is CO2. Greenhouse crops means they need a more concentration of CO2. C3 plants are the greenhouse crops. They need more concentration of CO2 to get maximum yield by reducing photorespiration. Photorespiration is a vomiting process. Fixed carbon is a decarboxylated, oxidized. So that's why we have to cultivate them in CO2 enriched climatic conditions, and where oxygen must be very less oxygen, not zero oxygen. So we have to cultivate C3 plants in the area where more CO2. So increased concentration of CO2 and a decreased concentration of oxygen. So if CO2 concentration more, oxygen less, photosynthetic yield more, and what about photorespiration? Very less. Otherwise, in that area, for example, oxygen more, O2 more, CO2 less, more photorespiration, sorry, more C2 cycle, less C3 cycle. Okay, increased CO2 concentration, less O2 concentration. Rate of C3 cycle more, less C2 cycle. Reverse. More oxygen, less CO2, more C2 cycle, less C3 cycle. And what about C4 plants? Less concentration is enough. Reason, C4 cycle is always able to enrich bundle sheath cells with more concentration of CO2. Definitely, the C3 cycle is not falling into photorespiration. Right? So that is about CO2 concentration. So definitely, according to textbook, CO2 is a limiting factor against the statement global warming. That is because of over concentration of CO2, right? Now, temperature. Last but one, temperature. Okay, so for any metabolic activity, optimum temperature is mandatory. So all these biochemical reactions, biochemical reactions regulated by or by enzymes, particularly. For example, proteinaceous enzymes. Proteinaceous enzymes. Okay, so what about the limiting factor of enzymes? High temperature. Most of the enzymes, proteinaceous enzymes, most of the enzymes, except a few, are thermosensitive, are not able to withstand, thermolabile, liable for damage. Okay, thermosensitive. Okay, so if the temperature is more than required, definitely, what about the metabolic rate declines? So in photosynthesis, two phases are present. Light phase, dark phase. Light phase or light reaction. And second one, dark. Okay. So light phase depends on, regulated by less number of enzymes. How many enzymes are involved? So light phase, it depends on, are regulated by, depends on less number of enzymes. Less number of enzymes. At the time of excitation of a electron from 680 or 700, no enzyme is required. For the transportation of electrons, generally no enzyme is required. In the case of light, how many enzymes are involved? According to this statement, overall it is dependent on enzymes, but less number of enzymes. What are those enzymes? So according to textbook, enzymes, just two only. What are they? One is NADP reductase, and second one ATP synthase. Only these two. So light reaction is least dependent on enzymes. Depends on only two kinds of enzymes. Moreover, in cyclic electron transport system, only ATP synthase. Non-cyclic, it needs both. If it is a non-cyclic, NADP reductase is required, ATP is required. If it is cyclic, only ATP is enough, not both. So light is less dependent on enzymes. So that's why light reaction is less affected by light reaction. Light phase is light reaction least affected or less affected by temperature, high temperature. So less extent damage. But what about dark reaction? All reactions depends on individual enzymes. Many enzymes are involved. Many are required. So if many required, definitely dark is more affected by temperature. More affected by temperature. The difference is, only the difference is number of enzymes. Least number of enzymes, many enzymes. Least number of enzymes, least affected. More number of enzymes, more affected. So optimum temperature depends on type of the plant, habitat also. Habitat deciding optimum temperature. For example, temperate climatic conditions. Temperate. Optimum temperature is 25 to 30 degrees. That is optimum temperature. Tropical climatic conditions. Desert. Tropical. So 25 to, 30 to 40 or beyond that also. 40 degrees temperature. So optimum temperature depends on habitat of the plant. Temperate habitat, tropical, like that. Right? So there is about temperature. So particularly, the role of temperature is linked with the enzymatic activity. The reason enzymes are sensitive to temperature. But what about thermostatic enzymes? They are able to perform even at high temperature, more than 80 degrees, 90 degrees. In the case of thermophilic bacteria and archaebacteria, enzymes are thermostatic, not labile. They're able to withstand. That is exemption, very rare case. So that is about a temperature. Fourth factor. Fourth one, water. Okay, so what about the effect of water? So direct effect on, directly on plant metabolism, plant growth and development, directly on the plant, indirectly on photosynthesis. So generally water is not a limiting factor, but in agronomy, agriculture, water is a limiting factor. But according to your textbook, what about a role of H2O? Directly impacting plant. What is that? A direct and indirect? We will see. Indirectly on photosynthesis. For example, water stress conditions. Water stress conditions. Drought conditions. What are the events? If water is limiting factor, first one. Okay, so closing down of stomata. Closing of stomata. Closing of stomata. Under a water stress conditions, in order to reduce the rate of transpiration, what about the stomata? Closing down. Sunken stomata, restricted to pits, not exposed to sunlight. So if stomata closed down, what about the impact? If stomata is closed down, internal concentration of CO2 concentration declines. Definitely. Next, if stomata closing down, rate of transpiration definitely declines. Next, rate of movement, transport declines. Distribution of materials declines. Under water stress conditions, what about leaves? Wilting, folding, wilting of leaves. Wilting means folded, wrinkles, folding. So if it is folded, surface area means if it is folded, surface area is hidden, not exposed to sunlight. Surface area exposed to light, less or not? Definitely. Wilting means less water, because of less water, no turgor pressure. Okay, so definitely less growth or no growth. So all these factors directly affecting the plant, indirectly on the photosynthesis. See, closing down the stomata leads to less concentration of CO2, less transpiration, less transport, and all these things. Directly on plant growth and development, indirectly on plant photosynthesis. Right? Next, last factor, oxygen. It was not given oxygen. Okay, so overconcentration of oxygen. Overconcentration, more concentration of CO2, more O2 concentration, more oxygen leads to photorespiration. In the case of C3 plants, more oxygen, definitely less is the photosynthetic yield, more is the loss of carbon. So more oxygen favors photorespiration, C2 cycle. In C3 plants, what about the rate of photosynthetic yield? Less. So the effect of the impact of oxygen on photosynthesis in the case of C3 plants is called as a Warburg effect. It favors photorespiration. It encourages photorespiration particularly. So that's about factors affecting rate of photosynthesis.